I am Ben. I am from a company called Mode. We build products for data analysts and data scientists. I'm not going to talk about that, though. I'm going to talk about the case for hiring more analysts and data scientists at your company. And so to start that off, sort of why do we have analysts at all? What is the point of them in your companies? It's to be data-driven. And everybody here probably agrees with that that's an important thing. But maybe the question to ask is, like, what does being data-driven really mean? So if we look at like the industry thought leaders that describe these sorts of things, we see stuff from folks like McKinsey that say that the fundamental objective of basically having data is to make better decisions. This is something that you can see kind of across the board for these types of folks. The Harvard Business Review had an article about being data-driven. The most common objectives for companies that are trying to do that is advanced analytics, which seems sort of tautological, but also making better decisions. And similarly, even for early-stage companies, folks like Sequoia have pointed out that data analytics is really valuable to helping define goals, set roadmaps, and define strategies. And so a very uncontroversial statement for this group is probably that data-driven means it is not dashboards and daily emails to execs. It is decision-making and strategic analysis. A slightly more controversial take on this, though, is we as companies collectively don't invest nearly enough in this. And one way that we can look at this is if we look at the percentage of companies that are actually analysts or data scientists, we tend to see charts like these. So these orange slivers are like the data organizations at some companies that were informally surveyed in some communities that I'm a part of. For the most part, these groups average somewhere between like 2 and 5%. So about 4% of a company is analytics focused. And given the kind of magnitude of the challenges that these folks are trying to solve around how do we define our roadmap, how do we define our strategy, that's a pretty low number. And to put it in like a different kind of context, say you have a company of like 100 employees. On average, a tech company of that size would spend about $1.7 million a month. They would spend about $75K on these data folks, plus some data tools that they would layer on top of that. Which again is a pretty small expenditure given the sorts of things that these folks are trying to accomplish. It's even smaller when you consider like what tech companies probably spend on something like lunch, that about half of their spending on data is what they would spend on feeding employees every day. So from this perspective, it's like we probably underinvest in this role. But I'll bet a lot of folks are sitting in this room and work at companies that have this kind of distribution of folks. And they still feel pretty data-driven. They still feel like they're listening to their data, they're making decisions based on data. And why is that? The reason why we see this when we talk to folks is that they use something like Selfserve. So they believe in what we need to do is open up our data to all of our employees. People can go get data on their own, and the entire company can be data-driven by nature of everybody having access to that data. I think that's important, though, to consider what Selfserve really is. What Selfserve is usually like a portal for you to be able to get data out of it. It is strictly like a data access tool. It doesn't tell you what to do with that data after the fact. It doesn't actually tell you how to analyze it. And so this access is not analysis. And what analysis is, if we go to some of the more sort of industry thought leaders, is it's thinking about problems. It's this like, how do we have logically sound arguments? How do we take the data we have, figure out what's meaningful in it, and make decisions based on that? And yet, if we think about what Selfserve does, Selfserve is saying everybody has these skills. It's assuming that yeah, we can solve the technology problem, but everybody has the ability to do this once they have access to that data. And I think that's something that a lot of folks, they probably don't agree with, but your company probably doesn't act like you agree with it either. Similar in this article, this author identified that they have, on average, 150 applicants for their data science and data analytics positions before they hire one, which means like they're filtering on these skills. When they're looking for these folks, they're filtering on this, we have to have folks that can apply this kind of analytical rigor, but then when they apply something like Selfserve, they're saying, actually, we don't care about that skill anymore. And there's a disconnect there. So another question is, we don't actually do this with other disciplines. It's kind of weird that we actually ask this of data as well. If you think about the idea of like other disciplines in your company like design, we don't have some notion of self-serve design. You're not asking folks to put together their own designs. You have a design team that does that for them. Similarly, you don't have self-serve marketing. You're not asking folks to go out and create their own marketing collateral. You have marketers that do that. And so, like, why is this? Why do we actually have folks that aren't data experts try to do their own analysis where we don't have designers or people doing their own design and marketing work? And I think the kind of most obvious reason is that anybody in this room can look at a website like Stripe and compare it to something like the California DMV site and know which one of these is well designed. Similarly, you can look at ads from Smith & Liggett or Nike and know which one of these ads is good. It's really obvious to anybody, whether or not you're a professional marketer or not, which one of these is worthwhile. However, if you look at two charts, so one of these charts is by Paul Krugman, the other is by Get to the Chopin, a Reddit user, and it's actually hard to tell which is which. We can't actually identify that. It's not obvious when you first look at it, even though there is a huge difference between the value of the analysis that goes behind these two charts. And so because of that, I think we tend to underemphasize the analytical skill that goes into the role and tend to just emphasize, can you create a chart at all? So to put that another way, like me knowing SQL and me knowing how to create a chart doesn't make me an analyst any more than knowing Photoshop makes me a designer. And similarly, like if I have a tool that eliminates the need for me to know SQL, it doesn't make me an analyst any more than a tool that eliminates me to know the need for Photoshop makes me a designer. These aren't the skills that define these professionals. The skills are what you do with this technical skill. And yet, again, with something like Selfserve, we tend to treat this as this is the skill that you need to learn. So this seems important, but does it really matter? Like at the end of the day, you're distributing data to the folks around your company. Is it that important that everybody has more analytical skill? Like how much does it actually matter? To tell that story, I want to share an example from a company that we talked to. It's a fairly large company. This is just some generic startup office to represent it. And they actually wanted to grow a lot. So they were focusing on growing a lot in 2019. They're actually planning on like doubling their headcount. And so they knew this was something that was really important to them. They realized that, hey, we're going to hire like twice as many people as we currently have. This is going to define what our company becomes. This is going to define the trajectory of where we go. And it's really important for us to get this right. And so like any data-driven company, they turned to their data and said, great, let's look at our data. Let's try to figure out what we should do and who we should hire. They then had some sort of self-serve tool. They pulled out a bunch of recruiting data. And what they found was that getting promoted is probably good, that who they hire, and if they get promoted, that's a signal of a successful hire. And junior hires tend to get it promoted a lot. And so they made the conclusion that, great, we should hire a bunch more junior people. If you're skeptical of that, you probably should be. There's a pretty obvious reason for that. Junior people are much more likely to get promoted because they have like a longer career path. It's hard to promote a principal engineer. You're not going to see a lot of promotions from that in 6 months after you hire them. If you hire an associate PM, a lot of them are going to get promoted. And yet, this happened because they didn't have any sort of analytical rigor in the room. There was nobody thinking about this problem when they were doing this, and it came very close to them actually shipping this. Like this was on the CEO's desk about to be rubber stamped before someone stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So analytical rigor helps occasionally avoiding these sorts of catastrophes, but it can also help with some other stuff. So it also can help spreading misinformation. So this is actually a lot more common thing that we see. And to tell the story, this is another example of a company that we worked with that was really afraid of sending a lot of email. So they had this notion that if they sent email and they sent too much of it, it was something that caused a lot of people to unsubscribe. They would lose a lot of their like email base. They needed to be really careful with sending email. And it probably came from I don't actually know where it came from, but it came from some analysis that somebody had done way back in the day. And this just became part of the folklore of this company. In general, sort of the instinct around anything to do with email was we shouldn't send too much. Someone then came along and did some analysis, and this is a little bit of a complicated chart, but basically these are like conversion rate increases by sending more email. What this shows is that the only thing that mattered, the only part of sending more email that actually hurt was this upper right-hand corner, which was sending more than 8 emails in 0 to 10 days. If you sent fewer emails than that or over a longer time frame, it actually had a really positive benefit, and in some cases a really, really big positive benefit. And yet, even after they did this analysis, it was hard to kind of remove this idea from their thinking that email is bad. It became just part of the culture, and it was a very difficult thing to get rid of. And if you think like, hey, I may be immune to that, I would consider your attitude on fat. So another example of this is that the sugar industry actually paid in the 1960s for a bunch of studies to show that fat is really bad for you. This is now something that like we intuitively kind of can't get rid of. That even though we know that may not be true, it's really hard for us not to have in the back of our minds, like, yeah, but we shouldn't be eating that much fat. And this is what happens at your company if you have a bunch of people doing this sort of analysis, that things that may or may not be true end up becoming part of the culture, and it's very hard to get rid of it once they're there. So a final thing that analytical rigor can help with is finding new opportunities. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest things that folks miss by not having more analysts. So an example of this is we actually worked with a company called The Knot. You may not be familiar with it by this name, but you're probably familiar with using the product. If you have any friends or family that get married and then you have a website like this, like DanielLovesSharon.com, it's probably created by The Knot. So they host a lot of these wedding websites. And you'll see this thing at the bottom that says, like, created on The Knot. So a few years back, they released a mobile app. They wanted to get people to use it. They saw this as kind of the future of their company. And in order to figure out how to get people to use it, they did kind of the traditional self-serve analysis of having a bunch of people go through Google Analytics, figure out what's there, figure out what it is that people like, and build a product around that. And so they really had a lot of problems getting this to stick. They'd release a feature, they'd see that nobody used it, they'd say, okay, let's try something different. This went on for a while until eventually one of their analysts came along and said, let's see if we can dig deeper. Let's see if we can actually like really figure out what it is that people like about this product. And so they put together this kind of visualization. This is this kind of path through the app and looking at which pages they used in the app. And you'll see there's this like kind of weird orange spiked or brown, I guess, spike down in the bottom right-hand corner. And what this was it was folks that would come back to the app. They came back every day and they used just one page. And the page that you used was this one, which is this countdown to your wedding day. And what they realized was folks were coming to this page, taking a screenshot of it, and then like posting it on Instagram, like, oh my God, I'm getting married in 89 days, 88 days, whatever. By finding that, they were able to lean on that and change the development of their product to focus on this functionality, to focus on, hey, this is a way that we can really get this to stick. They made it easier to share. They made it so you could add these pictures. And it became a much more successful app because they were able to figure out in a more targeted way what it is they should be building. So analytical rigor, find more opportunities, great. So what do we do with all this? The conclusion here is, great, let's hire more analytical thinkers, and not necessarily in like a Michaela Moroney terrible conclusion way. There is, though, a problem with this, which is it's really hard to hire these folks. You have to have 150 people apply before you can find one. That's a problem, though, if you think about who you're hiring. So the way that we often hire analysts and data scientists today is with something like this. We hire them with this notion of this is the Venn diagram of what a data scientist is. They need to have this analytical thinking, but they also need to have like engineering and development skills. They also need to be statisticians. It's very hard to find these folks. So one of the reasons it takes 150 applicants is because this is who you're looking for. But one of the things that Selfserve actually is really good at is eliminating the needs for some of these tools. That you don't actually need to have the engineering skills to do a lot of this analysis. You don't actually need the deep statistical expertise to do it. Really what you need is the analytical thinking. And so what you're really looking for is folks that are shaped much more like this. That having some background in these other areas is good, but you really want to emphasize the analytical and business expertise. And so finding these folks is actually much easier. And specifically, if you want to find these folks, there's a really good place to look, which is hiring social scientists. So social scientists are trained to think this way. They are analytical thinkers without some of the technical and quantitative background that a lot of STEM folks have. But they're much cheaper to hire, which is really good. You can hire a lot more of them. Also, they can solve some other problems that the industry has. So here's an opportunity for us to hire a lot more of these folks, to hire them at a lower cost, and to really fill the rooms with people that can think this way. To kind of wrap up, how do we become data-driven? If we just feel data-driven today, how do we actually become it? The first thing is, it's the driver, not the car. So the tool is the car. Self-serve is the car. It doesn't matter how good that car is. If I'm driving in a NASCAR race, it's going to suck. It's somebody who's actually a professional at driving it that matters. And so we should find people that are professionals at driving those cars, regardless of what tools we have. If we want to get value out of our data and we want to think about it reasonably, we need to make sure we have folks that know how to do that. The second thing is we should actually celebrate the analytical rigor that goes into this. Sort of the final example from the design world, one of the things that Apple does really well with design, and one of the reasons it's so much part of their culture, celebrate design thinking. The entire organization supports that idea. They don't just celebrate the products of design, they celebrate the craft that is design. And analytics and data science is the same. It's not just a technical skill. It's not just, can I get the data and can I model it? There is a craft to it that the more we celebrate, the more we can actually push that as a thing that matters. And finally, we should put more analysts in the room. So we should hire more of these folks. The company that had this hiring problem that almost ran to this kind of disaster, that was the conclusion that they walked away with, was it doesn't matter how much we scale like our chart building capabilities. It doesn't matter how much we scale the data team to be able to work with more folks. What matters is we have these people in the room when we're trying to make decisions. That anytime we're considering something important, we can't offload that and say, great, you have the data, you're going to make a better decision. We need more of these folks in the room. And so they made the decision, sort of the biggest hiring decision they made wasn't, hey, who do we hire? It was, hey, we need to find a lot more of these folks to actually help us make that decision. So with that, that's all I've got. I got questions. There you go.
Can you give us a bit more context on the company itself? When did you
Sure.
start and where are you now?
Sure. Yeah, so Mode started in 2013. It's based in San Francisco. It's currently about 80 or so folks. We build a product for analysts and data scientists. So basically what we see is there's a lot of analysts and data scientists out there whose job it is to help people make these decisions. And the way they do that is they need to be able to create analysis. There's like a workflow for that, and they need to be able to distribute that out to their organization. And so we build a product that really serves that workflow, that is a way that analysts and data scientists can be comfortable creating that work. It's an environment that's very native to them. But then when they want to distribute it, it's something that's very consumable by their customers. So rather than being something that's like, hey, here's a Python notebook, which is great for an analyst but terrible for a CEO, it's something that marries those two things together. So the analyst can work in the notebook environment they love, but then send a very like comfortable dashboard to their CEO. And there's a lot of stuff to automate that and build stuff on top of it if you want to.
Great. And are you targeting medium-sized enterprise like tech companies or the Fortune 1000?
So the size of a company is actually a little bit of a red herring for us. The thing that is important is that folks are invested in data. I'm not talking about this from a totally unbiased perspective. It's also important that they have an analytics team that's job is to help these folks answer questions. And so in some cases, that can be a really small company. If you're a company of 10 people, but you're heavily invested in this, then great, we can be a fit. If you're a large company and you're invested in this, great, we can be a fit. If you're somebody who doesn't care about this, then that's the place that we don't focus as much.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me open up for questions. One here.
Hi. I have a bias question here, but I won't give you my bias first. You say we should hire more analysts, and you say also that if we do focus on a specific skill set, we have actually a lot more applicants. By analysts, you mean all data analysis people or data analysts specifically? Is there a distinction between data analyst and data scientist?
So the way that we think about it is you should find folks that are really good at thinking about these problems. They need to be comfortable with data because that's the job, but those skills are much more teachable than skills that are like, how do I basically draw these conclusions about hiring or draw these conclusions about email? That's not a math problem as much as it is how do I construct this problem? How do I take an ambiguous business problem, apply that to my data, and turn that into a conclusion that we can move forward with? And so I think, yeah, at the end of the day, they're going to need SQL skills. They might need Python or R skills. They'll need something like Excel. But those things are learnable, whereas I think like the way of thinking is often harder to teach. In terms of data analysts and data scientists, there probably is a distinction. A lot of companies now have muddied that. Companies like Lyft have started to define data scientists as kind of everybody, and they have research scientists, which are kind of the traditional data scientists that build models. If you have to draw a line, we would draw it as there's folks who build models to help machines make decisions, and there's folks who like build charts and help humans make decisions at a much lower frequency. But how like the industry defines that is pretty muddy at the moment.
Hi. You mentioned that companies that care about data are a better fit for your product. How do you identify those companies? Is it like the number of people that have data in their title on LinkedIn, or what do you do to identify your prospects?
Roughly, yeah. I mean, in sort of that way. I think it's a combination of what kind of titles do folks have. If they have an analytics or data science team, they probably care about it. If we can't find that, they probably don't. Which tools are they using? If they're investing in other data tools, if they're investing in data warehouses like Redshift or Snowflake or even stuff like Oracle or Vertica, it's a good sign that they want to put effort towards that. It's usually not that hard to figure out like whether or not a company has some investment there. There are certainly companies that care a lot more than others that still have a bunch of analysts or data scientists. Like, you don't know how much political clout those folks have. But that's something that's a little bit harder to read, and we try to figure out through conversations with people or through connections we have.
Hi, what would you tell to newly graduates or students how to get better at analytical skills?
To just do it. I think that it's basically find problems that you're interested in and try to answer questions about it. If you take a bunch of practice problems, it doesn't really work. It doesn't stick. Like, what ends up happening is you answer the question to solve the practice problem and you don't push it any further. If you find a problem you're genuinely interested in, say you're like genuinely interested in data on healthcare, ask a question about that data. You'll find 3 things that you didn't expect, and then you'll start to say, great, I'm going to continue to look at this. I'm going to continue to like dig and figure out what more I can learn. And it's that kind of iteration that really helps people get a lot better. It also, if it's a domain that you know about, you recognize if you get it wrong. So like, if I were to look at something about healthcare data and it says 1,000 people in the country got the flu last year, I don't know if that's right or not. Like, sure, why not? If you're really familiar with it, you could look at that and be like, that's off by 2 orders of magnitude. I know that's wrong. I can kind of help coach myself through these problems. And so I think it's just asking those questions and sort of pushing yourself to do that makes you a lot better at it. It's not a series of like tutorials or practice problems.
All right, yeah, one more.
Just to piggyback on the question of how you find your clients, I was just wondering if you guys do anything in need recognition, if you guys subject potential clients to algorithms and you guys try to recognize need from maybe a lacking standpoint of if they need data or they're not being data driven at the moment, but they seem like if they were to optimize their operations with data, do you guys do things like that?
We try to help out with folks that are already on board with the idea. Like, we want to become data driven, and folks actually will come to us and say, hey, you work with a ton of folks to do this. Can you help us do that? We don't try to sell that idea that much. We don't try to say, hey, like, data is important to you. There are occasionally times we have to have those conversations in an organization where there are some folks who believe in it and some folks who don't, and we want to help the people who believe in it sort of find that argument. But if the company genuinely doesn't believe in it or there's no sort of movement there, it's not really worth our time to focus on that. And often you end up getting like, that's not worthwhile for us to try to convince those folks. But there are ways that we try to show, in some cases, things like this to say, hey, this is a valuable thing to invest in. If there's an executive who's like, I've always done it this way, this isn't the way we want to do it, but they have a data team that's saying, hey, this is the more modern way to think about it, and we want to push it.
Thank you. It's sort of fascinating, taking a step back, because here at this event for like years now, we've been talking about, data products, data companies, and all those things. And it's fascinating that, a few years in, there's still a large group of companies that you need to, very much to the question that you need to evangelize, right?
Yeah.
Where that's not going to work if you don't evolve to being a data-driven company.
Yeah, and a lot of folks don't know what to do with it. There's definitely a lot of folks we talk to that are like, yep, we believe in this, but what do we do? And so that's the conversation we have a lot too, is try to show people, here's some ideas, here's how you can actually make this valuable, rather than like, I read a McKinsey report, now what? So
great. Thank you so much, Ben. Appreciate it.